Hello and good morning. This is Kelsey from Kels Reads Things at Anna Porter Public Library in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. You can find my information on Instagram and through my YouTube channel here. I hope everyone is having a marvelous Monday, and I am very excited today to be discussing with you The X Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon. The X Talk is a adult romance comedy about two young people who work together in public radio, and it kind of takes the trope of fake dating and turns it on its head. And I really liked the unique take with this love story. So let's go ahead and dig into the plot. Okay, so The X Talk follows protagonist Shay Goldstein. She is a 29-year-old young woman who lives in Seattle. I believe she's lived in Seattle pretty much her entire life. She has a very good friend of whom I can't remember her name, and she's also the producer of one of her shows on her public radio show. Shay has been in love with public radio for as long as she can remember. I believe her father was a big, he was really into radio. He personally was a tinkerer. He fixed things. I'm pretty sure he was some kind of engineer. But according to Shay, the protagonist's voice, he had the perfect voice for radio. He had a love for public radio as well, and he shared that love with his daughter Shay. And it's really touching and really sweet that Shay ends up working in public radio herself, especially because a lot of her backstory is in her relationship with her father, who has passed away. I will go ahead and say that at the opening of this book, I believe he's been dead for 10 plus years. So public radio is something that's very near and dear to Shay's heart. And I think that that was one of the reasons why I really loved this story in general, was just Shay's background story and why she's in public radio to begin with. Okay, so moving on with the plot. So Shay is 29. She's producing her own show, yet she has yet to broadcast and perform, yet to speak in a show. And personally, even though she has aspirations and dreams to do this, she also unfortunately has some insecurities as well. Particularly about her voice. So she gets especially annoyed when young 24-year-old Dominic Yoon, who I believe is Korean, I think he's from North Korea originally, or his family is, he ends up being on the radio to discuss a big news story. And Shay and Dominic not necessarily don't get along, but Shay is not a big fan of Dominic because he comes off as arrogant. He comes off as, knowing so much better and being so much better than everyone because he cares about the news. He cares more about the news than he does specifically about hosting podcast shows in general. Whereas Shay is just happy to be able to provide a service for the community. So you got these two young people who both work together. Shay is not necessarily a big fan of Dominic, and Dominic is just kind of there. Doing his own thing when Kent, I think he's like the producer of the show, he's the head honcho of the show. He calls an emergency meeting for their radio show. He gets everyone on staff involved and asks for everyone to come up with an idea for new shows. And Shay comes up with a really brilliant idea, and it kind of this is like the backbone of the entire story. Her idea was to have a relationship show, but instead of having people who are in a relationship together, have them be exes, who ended on decent terms, I guess I should say, who ended things amicably, and they could just do random shows about relationships, and they don't even necessarily have to be romantic, they could also be platonic. So this was Shay's idea, and Kent loved it. But unfortunately, they needed some people who were actual exes. So Kent got the bright idea to put Dominic and Shay together to produce the show and pretend to have been exes. Meaning they were supposed to pretend to have been in a relationship at some point while working together. And thankfully, this brings these two characters together in all kinds of chaotic and hilarious ways. But will Shay be able to keep up with this disillusion? Will she be comfortable, in fact, lying to all of their listeners about having supposedly previously dated Dominic, especially when she knows almost nothing about him? And Dominic, of course, also has these reservations because he's very much a news focused man. So he feels a little bit off about the integrity of lying as well. And it's really interesting to see how this story, again, how it kind of flips that script, flips that sort of theme, that plot device, and how it brings these two together. And that's the general plot and premise of The X Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon. So, all that being said, I guess I should go ahead and now would be a good time to mention some of the triggers in this book. Obviously, there is a parent who is no longer present. I will say we don't really ever get to meet him other than in flashbacks. So, if you're a little hesitant about reading about stories of a past parent, that is something. And that's pretty much the only trigger warning necessarily that I can think of for this story specifically. So one thing that I really liked about this book is I learned a lot about like the radio industry and how it all works. So that was really fascinating to me. Any kind of book where it's light and fun and has relationships but also includes background information of how certain career paths work is definitely a positive for me. I thought that a lot of the characters were relatable yet frustrating at times, especially due to lack of communication between them, because that seems to be the major wedge between anyone in rom-coms. Any characters literally will have a wedge drawn because of lack of communication. Specifically Shay, I did like her. She unfortunately has just been through a lot in her life, especially in the last 10 years. She only has one really good friend she's close to who may be relocating to Virginia soon. She had an incredible job opportunity. She also, unfortunately, has had no luck in love. She always appears to get attached a lot faster than the other party and say, I love you first, and they, a lot of times, have not felt the same way. Pretty much every time, according to Shay, it hasn't worked out. So she's just kind of unlucky in love and kind of done with love, in fact. Dominic was great too. He definitely had a little bit in his past going on too, but none of that really is brought to the surface until later on into the book, so I won't really go into a lot of details about that, but do know that there is more to Dominic than meets the eye, and that seems to be a running theme with dark, tall, brooding men, is there is more than meets the surface. More to them than what meets the surface, I guess I should say. I thought just the device of bringing these two together was really unique. I loved the idea of a talk show about exes hosted by exes, or even not just exes, just romance and relationships in general. I just thought that was really unique and fun, and the concept was really cool to read about. The dialogue between characters was very witty and fun, very creative. The storyline in general was relatively entertaining. There were, I think, only a few times the story got a little bit slow or maybe dragged a little, but overall I was thoroughly entertained throughout. I really liked that this story was based in Seattle, Washington. I seem to gravitate towards those kinds of stories just because it seems to be such a progressive, incredible, unique city, and just in general, some of my favorite stories have been based in Seattle, so way to go, Seattle. And speaking of Seattle, I will say I think that the descriptions of the weather was some of the most accurate from this book. There have definitely been books I've read about Seattle's weather, and I've just been like, I don't think that's very accurate. So it was really cool seeing how this podcast, something that, Shay was passionate about, she'd always wanted to host a show. She always wanted to speak on one. And when she finally did get to do this now, 10 years being at this station, it was just really cool seeing, or I guess listening to, because I listened to the audiobook, listening to the success that their show was going through. They became what's the word I'm looking for here? Viral, like within a few weeks, and that was wonderful to read about. I really liked that Shay was vulnerable, especially in terms of her insecurities in regards to her voice. I personally have had some similar insecurities. I think we all have insecurities, of course, but I think just how the author presented this to the page without Shay seeming like a weak, typically written female character. Not to say typical, but just in the past, there's always been, how do I say this? I like that her femininity did not make her a lesser character or was necessarily, written as a flaw. It was something that she recognized as a flaw, but other characters didn't. And I just in general really liked about like how that was written and the responsibility of the author and just the way she handled that. I also really liked how maturely Dominic and Shay were able to, get through their trials, get through their humps, get through, the nitty gritty of their relationship, whether it be friendship, whether it be more. There was just a lot of work and communication between them, especially towards, the big issue, because there's always a big issue in a rom-com book, because otherwise there really wouldn't be a plot. But in general, I liked how the characters handled the situation and how they were able to resolve their issues. And all that being said, because I thoroughly enjoyed this book, I thought it was unique. I enjoyed the unique plot points of, putting these two characters together who are exes. I really liked, in general, the characters. I thought Shay was relatable, and I thought that Dominic was also relatable. I liked their friends. Just in general, it was an entertaining story where I learned a little more about public radio and how that works. And in general, it's a story I would recommend to pretty much anyone who wants something kind of lighthearted and fun, but also have some sustenance and meat to it as well. All that being said, I thoroughly enjoyed the X Talk, and because of that, I gave it 4.5 stars. Thanks for viewing my video with me today. I really enjoy discussing books here, and I can't wait to discuss with you probably this Friday. I'll either be discussing Beach Read by Emily Henry, or I will be discussing Or Yoke by Mary H.K. Choi. Thanks again for stopping by. I look forward to discussing more books with you in the future, and I hope you have a magnificent Monday.